In the quiet fields of Darrowby Downs, a champion racehorse, Firebrand, vanishes on the eve of the Grand Stakes, threatening ruin for his owner, Reginald Harcourt. Whispers of sabotage swirl around a nervous jockey, a stoic trainer, and a cunning rival. Lord Ashby. Only Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and unerring knack for truth, can unravel the web of secrets, pipe cleaners, willow leaves, and a monogrammed cloth, leading to a hidden barn and a limping stranger. In a race against time, she exposes ambition and betrayal, restoring Firebrand to the starting line and justice to the finish. The truth, like a horse, cannot stay hidden forever. Chapter 1. The Disappearance at Darrowby Downs. The morning mist clung to the rolling fields of Darrowby Downs, softening the edges of the hedgerows and lending an ethereal quality to the sprawling race course that lay at the heart of the county's most anticipated event. The Grand Stakes, a fixture in the social calendar of every gentleman farmer and sporting enthusiast from here to London, was but a day away. The air thrummed with expectation, for this year's race promised a spectacle. Firebrand, a chestnut stallion of remarkable lineage and fiery spirit, was the undisputed favorite, his name whispered in betting circles and drawing rooms alike. His sleek form and thunderous gallop had already secured victories at Ascot and Newmarket, and now, on the eve of the Grand Stakes, all eyes were upon him. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in the cozy dining room of Colonel Bantry's Georgian Manor in St. Mary Mead, some 10 miles from the Downs, heard the first whispers of trouble over a breakfast of kedgeree and toast. The Colonel, a ruddy-faced man whose passion for racing rivaled his love of a good claret, was in a state of high agitation. His fork hovered forgotten above his plate as he recounted the news, delivered by a breathless stable lad who had ridden over at dawn. "It's outrageous, Jane," he exclaimed, his mustache quivering. "Firebrand, gone, vanished from his stall sometime in the night. Not a hoof print, not a broken lock, nothing. The race is tomorrow, and the finest horse in England is nowhere to be found." Miss Marple, her small bird-like figure wrapped in a shawl of soft gray wool, sipped her tea with measured calm. Her pale blue eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, betrayed no hint of the curiosity that stirred within her. She was no stranger to the ways of horses, having spent her girlhood in a village where the vicar's pony was as much a parishioner as any soul in the pews. But it was not the horse itself that intrigued her. It was the human tangle behind its disappearance. "Most distressing," she murmured, setting her cup down with a delicate clink. "And yet, Arthur, I find that when something, or someone, goes missing, there is always a reason. People are seldom as careful as they believe themselves to be." Colonel Bantry, accustomed to Miss Marple's cryptic observations, grunted. "Foul play, that's what it is. Thieves, or worse, someone with a grudge. Firebrand's owner, Reginald Harcourt, is beside himself, they say, and the trainer, Brady, swears the stables were secure. I'm half a mind to go down there myself and see what's what." Miss Marple tilted her head, her white hair catching the morning light. "Perhaps we might both go, Arthur. A racecourse, I imagine, is not unlike a village, full of gossip and secrets, if one knows where to look." The Colonel, recognizing the glint in her eye, agreed with a reluctant chuckle, and by mid-morning they were rattling along the country lanes in his old Bentley, the Downs rising before them like a green wave under the clearing sky. Darrowby Downs was a scene of barely contained chaos. The stables, A series of low, whitewashed buildings flanked by willows buzzed with activity. Stable lads darted to and fro, their faces taut with worry, while a pair of constables from the county police stood scratching their heads by Firebrand's empty stall. Reporters, sensing a scandal, loitered near the paddock, notebooks in hand, their questions met with curt deflections from the head groom. Miss Marple, stepping lightly from the car, took in the scene with a quiet intensity. Her black lace mittens were clasped before her, and her sensible hat, adorned with a single violet ribbon, sat firmly upon her head. She looked to all the world like a harmless spinster out for a morning's diversion, but her mind was already at work, sifting through the clamor for the threads of truth. The colonel introduced her to the stable manager, a wiry man named Perkins, whose eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "It's a mystery, ma'am," he said, tipping his cap. "Firebrand was here at 9 last night when Mr. Brady locked up. I checked the bolts myself at midnight, and all was well. Come dawn, the stall's empty, and not a soul saw a thing." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her gaze drifting to the stall in question. The door hung open now, its heavy iron latch gleaming in the sunlight. The straw within was undisturbed, save for a faint scattering near the entrance, where a few clumps of dried mud caught her eye. She bent closer, her movements slow and deliberate, and noted a peculiar scent, faint, acrid, like pipe tobacco mixed with something sweeter, perhaps liniment. "Curious," she said softly, straightening up. "One would expect more disorder if a horse were taken by force, and yet this stall is almost too tidy." Perkins frowned, unsure whether to take her seriously, but Miss Marple was already moving on, her eyes scanning the ground for further clues. A single hoofprint, half obscured by a wheelbarrow's track, lay near the stable's outer door. She filed it away, along with the faint glint of a metal object, a buckle, perhaps, caught in the grass nearby. As they returned to the car, Colonel Bantry muttered about sabotage and bookmakers' plots. Miss Marple, however, was thinking of quieter things, the way a village shopkeeper might notice a stranger's boots, or how a maid's gossip could unravel a theft. "Darrowby Downs," she said almost to herself, "is not so different from St. Mary Mead. People leave traces, Arthur, even when they think they've covered them well." The colonel snorted, but he knew better than to dismiss her. Miss Marple's knack for seeing what others missed had solved stranger puzzles than this. As they drove back to St. Mary Mead, she gazed out at the passing fields, her mind weaving the first strands of a pattern that, in time, would reveal the truth behind the Vanished Racehorse. Chapter 2. The Players in the Game. The sun had climbed high above Darrowby Downs by the time Miss Jane Marple, accompanied by Colonel Bantry, arrived at the racecourse. The morning's mist had burned away, leaving the air sharp with the scent of trampled grass and polished leather. The stables, though still abuzz with the shock of Firebrand's disappearance, had settled into a tense rhythm, with grooms tending to the remaining horses and officials conferring in low, urgent tones. Miss Marple, her black lace mittens clasped demurely before her, stepped lightly from the colonel's Bentley, her eyes scanning the scene with the quiet alertness of a sparrow. She had no great knowledge of racing, but she understood people, and it was people, she knew, who lay at the heart of this mystery. Colonel Bantry, his face flushed beneath his tweed cap, was already striding toward the stable manager Perkins, who stood barking orders near the main paddock. "Come along, Jane," he called over his shoulder. "Let's get to the bottom of this." Miss Marple followed at her own pace, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. She had no intention of hurrying. Haste, she often observed, obscured the small details that mattered most. As she approached the stables, she noted the cluster of onlookers, reporters with pencils poised, local farmers drawn by the scandal, and a handful of racecourse staff whispering among themselves. Their faces, she thought, were like those in Saint. Merry Mead after a village theft, a mix of curiosity, fear, and something less definable. Guilt, perhaps, or the anticipation of it. Perkins, a wiry man with a face like weathered oak, greeted the colonel with a curt nod. "No news, sir," he said, his voice clipped. "Police have been over the stall twice. Not a clue how the beast was taken." He glanced at Miss Marple, his eyes flickering with polite dismissal, as if her presence were a mere courtesy to the colonel. She smiled faintly, accustomed to being underestimated. "A most perplexing situation, Mr. Perkins," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Might we meet those closest to Firebrand? The owner, perhaps, and the trainer?" Perkins hesitated, then nodded, gesturing toward a group of men standing near a sleek, black motor car parked by the stable's entrance. The first to approach was Reginald Harcourt, Firebrand's owner, a man whose florid complexion and tailored suit spoke of wealth, if not composure. His hands, adorned with a heavy gold ring, twisted the chain of a pocket watch as he spoke, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Miss Marple, is it? And Colonel Bantry, good of you to come. This is a disaster, an absolute disaster. Firebrand was my finest horse, worth a king's ransom, and now, poof, gone." His eyes, bloodshot and restless, darted toward the stables, then back to the ground, as if seeking something he could not name. Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his fingers, and the way his voice rose, not with grief, but with a nervous energy that bordered on theatrical. "I understand your distress, Mr. Harcourt," she said gently, her tone that of a kindly aunt soothing a fretful child. "Firebrand was a remarkable creature, I'm told. Had you seen him recently?" Harcourt blinked, as if the question caught him off guard. "Well, no, not yesterday. I was in London, you see, on business. Left everything to Brady, my trainer. He's the best in the business, been with me for years." His gaze slid toward a stocky man standing a few paces away, and Miss Marple followed it, her interest piqued. Tom Brady, the trainer, was a man of middle years, his face etched with the lines of a life spent outdoors. His eyes, a pale gray, held a guarded intensity, and his hands, rough and calloused, were folded tightly across his chest. He wore a flat cap pulled low, and his tweed jacket, though well made, bore the faint stains of stable work. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and gruff, "I locked the stable myself last night, 9 o'clock sharp. Firebrand was there, fit as ever. No one could have got in without breaking the door down, and there's not a mark on it." His words were steady, but Miss Marple caught the faintest tightening of his jaw. A sign, she thought, of something held back. "And you heard nothing unusual?" she asked, her head tilted slightly, as if the question were mere curiosity. Brady shook his head. "Nothing. I live just up the lane. Sleep light. Would have heard a pin drop." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to his boots, which were caked with dried mud. Not the fine, powdery soil of the stable yard, but a heavier, clay-like earth. She made no comment, but her mind tucked the detail away, like a piece of embroidery thread waiting for its pattern. Next came Jimmy Walsh, the jockey, a wiry young man of 22, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to flinch from direct contact. His hands fidgeted with the brim of his cap, and his riding boots, polished to a gleam, tapped nervously against the ground. "I don't know nothing about it, ma'am," he said before Miss Marple could speak, his voice high and defensive. "I was to ride Firebrand tomorrow, biggest race of my career. Why would I let him go missing?" His words were earnest, but his pallor and the sheen of sweat on his brow told a different story. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Of course, Mr. Walsh, but it must be a shock, losing such a chance. Where were you last night, if I may ask?" Jimmy hesitated, his fingers tightening on his cap. "At the Red Lion, ma'am, the pub in Darrowby. Had a pint or two, then went home." His eyes flicked toward Brady, then away, and Miss Marple noted the glance, as well as the faint tremor in his voice. "A pint or two," she repeated softly, as if savoring the phrase. "And no one else saw you, perhaps, leaving the pub?" Jimmy's flush deepened, but he shook his head. She let the matter drop, her expression unchanged, though her mind was already turning over the boy's unease. The final figure was Lord Cedric Ashby, owner of Silver Streak, Firebrand's chief rival. He approached with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to command, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight and his tailored suit impeccable. His smile was warm, but his eyes, a piercing blue, held a sharpness that Miss Marple recognized at once. "Miss Marple, Colonel Bantry," he said, his voice smooth as polished oak. "A grim business, this. Firebrand was a fine horse, and Harcourt has my sympathies." His tone was sympathetic, but Miss Marple caught the faintest trace of satisfaction in his posture, the way his shoulders squared as he spoke of his rival's loss. "Most kind of you, Lord Ashby," she said, her voice mild. "Your own horse, Silver Streak, must now be the favorite, I presume?" Ashby's smile tightened, just for a moment. "The race is anyone's game, Miss Marple, but yes, Silver Streak is in fine form. Still, I'd rather win fairly than profit from another's misfortune." His words were polished, but Miss Marple's keen ears detected a note of rehearsal, as if he had prepared the sentiment in advance. She nodded, her eyes lingering on his pristine gloves, which bore no trace of the stable's dust or grime. As the group dispersed, Harcourt to confer with the police, Brady to check the remaining horses, Walsh to hover nervously by the paddock, and Ashby to his gleaming motor car. Miss Marple lingered by the stable entrance. The police had cordoned off Firebrand's stall, but she managed a closer look, her small figure slipping past a distracted constable. The stall was indeed pristine, the straw barely disturbed, but her sharp eyes caught a few anomalies. A faint scuff on the wooden wall, as if something heavy had brushed against it, and a single chestnut hair caught in a splinter near the latch. She bent closer, her nose wrinkling at the lingering scent of pipe tobacco, now mingled with a sharper note, perhaps turpentine or some stable liniment. Tucked beneath a corner of the straw was a small, crumpled leaf, not the broad sycamore of the nearby trees, but something narrower, like willow. She slipped it into her handbag, unnoticed by the bustling grooms. "Jane, what are you poking about for?" Colonel Bantry's voice boomed from behind, startling a nearby stable lad. Miss Marple straightened, her expression serene. "Merely observing, Arthur. A stable is like a drawing room, you know, full of traces of those who pass through." The colonel snorted, but he knew better than to question her methods. As they walked back to the car, she paused by a water trough, noting a faint smear of grease on its edge. Motor oil, perhaps, or something mechanical. It was out of place in a stable, and she filed it away with the other fragments. The mud on Brady's boots, Jimmy's nervous glance, Ashby's too perfect composure, Harcourt's theatrical distress. Back at St. Mary Mead, over a late luncheon of cold ham and chutney, Colonel Bantry pressed her for her thoughts. "Well, Jane, who's your money on? Harcourt's too rattled to be behind it, I'd wager. Brady's solid as a rock, but that jockey, Walsh, looked shifty to me. And Ashby's got motive, with Silver Streak in the running." Miss Marple buttered a slice of bread with care, her movements deliberate. "Motive, Arthur, is only part of the picture. People are like skeins of wool, tangled, but with a thread that runs true. Mr. Harcourt is frightened, but not, I think, of losing his horse. Mr. Brady knows more than he says, though he guards his words like a safe. Young Mr. Walsh is afraid, but fear can come from many sources. And Lord Ashby—" She paused, her eyes distant. "He is a man who plays to win, but not always by the rules." The colonel frowned, chewing thoughtfully. "You think one of them took Firebrand? But how? The stable was locked. Perkins said so." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "Locks, Arthur, are only as strong as the hands that turn them, and hands, I find, often leave traces, mud, grease, a leaf, a scent, small things, but they speak loudly to those who listen." She sipped her tea, her mind already weaving the threads of Darrowby Downs into a pattern. The players were in place, each with their secrets, and Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and unerring instinct, was ready to unravel them. Chapter 3. The Owner's Burden. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Reginald Harcourt's manor, a sprawling edifice of red brick and ivy that stood a mile from Darrowby Downs. Its tall windows gleamed with the last light of the day, and the air carried the faint sweetness of roses from the gardens. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the back of Colonel Bantry's Bentley, gazed out at the approaching house with her usual quiet attentiveness. She had accepted Harcourt's invitation to dine, sensing that the owner's distress over Firebrand's disappearance might reveal more in the intimacy of his home than in the chaos of the racecourse. Colonel Bantry, grumbling about the inconvenience but secretly intrigued, had agreed to accompany her, his curiosity stoked by Miss Marple's cryptic hints at luncheon. As they stepped into the grand hall, with its polished oak floors and portraits of stern-faced ancestors, Harcourt greeted them with a forced joviality that did little to mask his agitation. His florid cheeks were flushed, and his hands, still clutching that ever-present watch-chain, moved restlessly. "Miss Marple, Colonel, so good of you to come," he said, his voice loud but unsteady. A grim day indeed, but we must keep spirits up, mustn't we?" He led them into a dining room aglow with candlelight, where a table was set with fine china and a centerpiece of hothouse lilies. The opulence felt strained, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, in her simple black dress adorned with a single brooch, took her seat with a murmured word of thanks. She noted the slight tremor in Harcourt's hand as he poured sherry, and the way his eyes flicked toward the door, as if expecting an interruption. The meal, roast pheasant, new potatoes, and asparagus in a delicate sauce, was served by a butler, whose impassive face gave nothing away, though Miss Marple caught the faintest glance he exchanged with Harcourt when the conversation turned to Firebrand. "A terrible loss," Harcourt said, sawing at his meat with unnecessary vigor. "That horse was my pride, my legacy, worth a fortune, and not just in money. To think someone could steal him from under our noses. His voice rose, and he reached for his glass, downing a gulp of claret. Miss Marple, nibbling delicately at her asparagus, tilted her head. "It is most distressing, Mr. Harcourt. A horse like Firebrand must have been closely guarded. You were in London, you said, when he vanished?" Her tone was gentle, almost apologetic, as if she were merely clarifying a trifling detail. Harcourt nodded, his fingers tightening on the stem of his glass. Yes, business matters. Left early yesterday, back this morning when I heard the news. Brady had everything in hand. Trustworthy fellow, Brady. Been with me for years." His words were emphatic, but Miss Marple noted a fleeting shadow in his eyes, a hesitation that belied his confidence. "Trust is such a delicate thing," she said softly, her eyes meeting his for a moment, before dropping to her plate. "And yet, even the most trustworthy can be surprised by cunning. Tell me, Mr. Harcourt, do you know of anyone who might wish you ill? A rival, perhaps?" She paused, her fork poised, and the room seemed to still. Harcourt's flush deepened, and he coughed, reaching for his napkin. "Rivals? Well, racing's a competitive world, Miss Marple. Lord Ashby now, he's got his silver streak, and there's no love lost between us. Old business disagreement years ago. But sabotage? Surely not." His laugh was brittle, and he avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the butler, who was clearing plates with silent efficiency. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Of course," she said, as if dismissing the notion, though her mind was cataloguing every nuance, the way Harcourt's hand shook as he mentioned Ashby, the quick glance toward the door, the butler's subtle nod. She turned the conversation to lighter matters, the beauty of the gardens, the history of the manor, watching as Harcourt relaxed, his tension easing with each sip of wine. Yet she sensed a man under siege, not by the loss of his horse alone, but by something deeper, more personal. His wealth, she thought, was a shield, but a fragile one. After dinner they retired to the drawing-room, where a fire crackled in the grate despite the mild evening. Colonel Bantry, fortified by port, launched into a tale of a race he'd attended in '09, leaving Miss Marple to observe Harcourt more closely. He stood by the mantel, staring into the flames, his fingers still twisting that watch chain. She rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and joined him, ostensibly to admire a porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece. "A fine piece," she said, her voice low. "You have an eye for beauty, Mr. Harcourt. Firebrand, I imagine, was much the same, a thing of value, but also of pride." Harcourt started, as if her words had struck a nerve. "Pride, yes," he muttered. "And now it's all at risk. The race, my reputation." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow, despite the cool room. "Reputation is a curious thing," she said, almost to herself. "It can be tarnished by others' actions, can it not? A rival's ambition, a servant's oversight." She let the words hang, watching as Harcourt's eyes widened, then narrowed. "No one in my employ would betray me," he said sharply, but his hand betrayed him, clutching the watch chain so tightly the links bit into his palm. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, and returned to her seat, her mind turning over the man's fear. It was not, she thought, the fear of a man who had lost a horse, but of one who dreaded what that loss might reveal. As the evening drew to a close, Harcourt excused himself to take a telephone call, leaving Miss Marple and the Colonel in the drawing-room. She wandered to the window, peering out at the darkened gardens, where a faint light flickered near the stables in the distance. "Curious," she murmured, her breath misting the glass. "One would think the stables would be quiet at this hour." Colonel Bantry, half dozing in his chair, roused himself. "What's that, Jane? Seeing ghosts now?" She smiled, her eyes still on the light. "Not ghosts, Arthur, merely traces of those who move in the dark." On the drive back to St. Mary Mead, the colonel pressed her for her thoughts. "Harcourt's a wreck," he said, steering through the winding lanes. "But he's no crook, I'd wager. Too much to lose. What do you make of him?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her face serene in the dim light of the car. "Mr. Harcourt is a man carrying a burden, Arthur. Not just the loss of Firebrand, but something heavier. He speaks of trust, but I wonder if he trusts himself. And that light in the stables, someone is still searching, or perhaps hiding." The colonel grunted, unconvinced, but Miss Marple's mind was already weaving the threads of the evening. Harcourt's trembling hands, the butler's glance, the flicker of light in the distance. Small things, but in her experience, small things were the keys to great secrets. Chapter 4. The Trainer's Silence. The morning air was crisp as Miss Jane Marple stepped out of Colonel Bantry's Bentley, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders against the early chill. The village of Darrowby lay quiet, its thatched cottages and winding lanes still half asleep under a veil of dew. Their destination was a modest stone cottage just beyond the downs, home to Tom Brady, Firebrand's trainer. Miss Marple had suggested the visit over breakfast, her gentle insistence cutting through the colonel's grumbling about the hour. "A trainer knows his horse better than anyone, Arthur," she had said, her eyes bright with purpose. "And what he chooses not to say may tell us more than what he does." The colonel, though skeptical, had learned to trust her instincts, and so they set off, the Bentley's engine humming through the waking countryside. Brady's cottage stood at the edge of a narrow lane, its garden bordered by a low hedge and a riot of marigolds that seemed at odds with the man's stern demeanor. As they approached, Miss Marple noted the tidy order of the place, the swept path, the neatly stacked firewood, the stable boots aligned by the door, their soles crusted with that same heavy clay she had observed at the racecourse. The door opened before they could knock, revealing Brady himself, his weathered face set in a mask of guarded courtesy. He wore a worn tweed waistcoat, and his hands, rough as old leather, gripped a bridle he had been polishing, its brass fittings gleaming in the morning light. "Colonel Bantry, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and deliberate, like a man measuring his words. "Didn't expect visitors so early. Come in if you like." The interior of the cottage was as spare as its owner, with a scrubbed oak table, a single armchair by the hearth, and a shelf of racing journals stacked with military precision. A faint smell of linseed oil hung in the air, mingling with the earthier scent of stable hay. Miss Marple settled into a chair offered by Brady, her small figure dwarfed by its sturdy frame, and folded her hands in her lap. "You have a charming home, Mr. Brady," she said, her tone warm but probing. "It speaks of a man who values order. I imagine you run your stables much the same way." Brady nodded, setting the bridle on the table with a careful thud. "Aye, ma'am, a stable's no place for chaos. Horses need routine, and Firebrand was no exception. Fed at 6, groomed at 7, locked in by 9 last night. All as it should be." His eyes, pale and unyielding, met hers briefly, before dropping to the bridle, as if it demanded his attention. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "And yet, Firebrand is gone," she said softly. "A puzzle, is it not? A locked stable, a horse vanished, and no sign of a struggle. One might almost think he walked out of his own accord." Brady's hands stilled, and for a moment the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the mantel. "No horse walks out alone," he said at last, his voice gruff. "Someone got in, though I'll be damned if I know how. The lock's solid, and I've the only key." He patted his pocket, where a faint jingle confirmed his words. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes resting on his hands, which bore faint smudges of oil. Not the linseed of the bridle, but something darker, like axle grease. "You locked the stable yourself, you said," she continued, her tone as mild as if she were discussing the weather. "And you heard nothing unusual? No voices? No footsteps?" "Nothing," Brady said, his jaw tightening. "I was here by 9:30, asleep by 10. I'm a light sleeper, ma'am. A creak in the floorboards wakes me. If someone was at the stables, I'd have heard." His words were firm, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his posture, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing for a blow. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "And do you smoke a pipe, Mr. Brady? I noticed a curious scent in the stable. Tobacco, perhaps, mixed with something sharp." Brady's eyes narrowed, and he shook his head a touch too quickly. "No pipe, ma'am. Cigarettes now and then, but not last night. Must have been one of the lads." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, though her mind was cataloguing the lie. The scent in the stable had been distinct, not the acrid bite of cigarettes, but the richer, sweeter note of pipe tobacco. She let the matter pass, turning her attention to the room. A small photograph on the shelf caught her eye. Brady, younger, standing beside a horse that bore a striking resemblance to Firebrand, with a boy of perhaps 16 at his side. "A fine horse," she said, gesturing to the photograph. "A relation of Firebrand's, perhaps." Brady's expression softened just for a moment. "His sire, Thunderbolt, best horse I ever trained. That's my nephew, Peter, with him. Lad's a stable hand now, works at the Downs." "Peter," Miss Marple repeated, her tone thoughtful. "A good boy, I'm sure. Young men often see things their elders miss." Brady's face closed again, and he busied himself with the bridle, his fingers moving with unnecessary force. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Mr. Brady. You've been most helpful. I shan't keep you from your work." As they stepped outside, she paused by the garden gate where a young man, Peter, she presumed, was raking leaves, his movements quick and nervous. His eyes darted toward Brady, then away, and Miss Marple felt a prickle of interest. She approached him, her handbag clasped before her, and offered a peppermint from a tin she kept for such occasions. "You must be Peter," she said, her voice warm. "A fine morning for gardening." The boy, no more than 18, flushed and took the sweet, his fingers trembling slightly. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled, glancing at Brady, who was watching from the doorway. Miss Marple lowered her voice, as if sharing a confidence. "It must be hard, working at the stables with all this trouble. You were there last night, I suppose?" Peter hesitated, then nodded. "Aye, till 8. Helped Mr. Brady lock up." His eyes flicked toward the cottage again, and Miss Marple sensed his reluctance. "And did you see anything unusual?" she asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. Peter's flush deepened, and he muttered, "No, ma'am. Just Mr. Brady was out later, near the downs. Saw him talking to someone, but it was dark. Couldn't see who. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained serene. "How interesting," she said, offering another peppermint. "You're a sharp lad, Peter. Keep your eyes open, won't you?" She rejoined Colonel Bantry, who was pacing by the car, impatient to be off. "Well, Jane, any revelations?" he asked, his tone half-teasing. She climbed into the Bentley, her mind turning over Peter's words. "Only that Mr. Brady is a man who keeps his own counsel, Arthur. And yet, even the most silent have their secrets. That boy, Peter, he sees more than he says, and I fancy he may yet tell us something useful." As they drove back to St. Mary Mead, the colonel pressed her further, but Miss Marple only smiled, her thoughts on the clay on Brady's boots, the oil on his hands, and the boy's nervous glance. Small things, she knew, but in her experience, small things were the threads that unraveled the tightest knots. Brady's silence was a wall, but walls, she thought, always had their cracks. Chapter 5. The Jockey's Fear. The Red Lion, Darrowby's sole public house, stood at the heart of the village, its weathered sign creaking in the midday breeze. Its low-beamed interior, redolent of ale and polished wood, was a hub of local life, where farmers, grooms, and the occasional gentleman from the downs mingled over pints and gossip. Miss Jane Marple, guided by a quiet instinct, had persuaded Colonel Bantry to accompany her there after their visit to Tom Brady's cottage. "Young Mr. Walsh spends his evenings at the Red Lion, I'm told," she had remarked over tea, her eyes twinkling with purpose. "A public house, Arthur, is much like a village sewing circle, full of chatter that reveals more than the speakers intend." The colonel, though he muttered about wasting time in smoky tap rooms, had agreed, and so they found themselves stepping into the pub's dim warmth, the air alive with the murmur of voices and the clink of glasses. Jimmy Walsh was easy to spot, slouched at a corner table near the fire, his slight frame hunched over a half-empty pint. His jockey's build, wiry, compact, built for speed, seemed diminished here, as if the weight of the day's events pressed him into the worn oak bench. His dark hair fell untidily across his forehead, and his eyes, shadowed and restless, darted toward the door with every new arrival. Miss Marple, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, approached with the unhurried grace of a vicar's aunt, her handbag clasped before her like a talisman. Colonel Bantry followed, his tweed-clad bulk drawing curious glances from the regulars. "Mr. Walsh," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the pub's low hum. "Might we join you for a moment?" Jimmy started, his pint sloshing slightly, and his eyes flicked from Miss Marple to the colonel, wary as a cornered hare. "Aye, ma'am, Colonel," he said, his voice high and strained. "Didn't expect to see you here." He gestured to the chairs opposite, his hand trembling just enough to catch Miss Marple's notice. She settled into the seat, her posture prim, and smiled with the gentle warmth that had disarmed many a reluctant confidant. "It's a trying time, Mr. Walsh," she began, her tone sympathetic. "Losing Firebrand must be a blow, especially for a young man with such a promising ride ahead." Jimmy's face paled, and he gripped his glass tightly, his knuckles whitening. "It's a nightmare, ma'am," he said, his words tumbling out. "Firebrand was my chance, biggest race of my life. I'd never do anything to harm him, but folks are talking, saying I might have had a hand in it. Me, as if I'd throw away my future." His voice cracked, and he took a quick swig of ale, as if to steady himself. Miss Marple's eyes, keen behind her spectacles, studied him closely. She noted the sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his left hand fidgeted with a frayed cuff, and the faint bruise on his wrist, half hidden by his sleeve. "No one doubts your devotion to Firebrand, Mr. Walsh," she said soothingly. "But suspicion falls easily in such times. Tell me, where were you last night, when the horse was taken? It might help to set matters straight." Jimmy hesitated, his eyes darting to the bar, where a buxom barmaid was wiping glasses with a practiced hand. "Here, ma'am," he said at last. "At the Red Lion, till closing. Had a few pints, played darts with some lads. Ask Nellie, she'll tell you." He nodded toward the barmaid, who glanced over and gave a curt nod, as if accustomed to vouching for her patrons. Miss Marple smiled, her expression unchanging. "And you stayed the whole evening? No stepping out, perhaps, for a breath of air?" Jimmy's flush deepened, and he shifted in his seat. "Well, maybe for a minute or two, round 10, just for a smoke, you know. Nothing more." His voice was defiant, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, and Miss Marple caught it, like a seamstress spotting a loose thread. "A cigarette, I presume?" she asked lightly, her hands folding neatly in her lap. Jimmy nodded too quickly. "Aye, cigarettes. Don't touch a pipe. Too fussy for me." His laugh was forced, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tugged at his cuff, as if to hide the bruise. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "It must be difficult, Mr. Walsh, carrying the hopes of so many. A young man in your position, there are always those who might press for favors, or debts, perhaps." Jimmy's eyes widened, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. "I don't owe nobody nothing," he said, his voice rising. "I'm clean, ma'am, I swear it." But his hands betrayed him, clenching into fists, and Miss Marple saw the shadow of desperation in his gaze. Colonel Bantry, who had been silent, cleared his throat. "Come now, lad, no need to get worked up. Miss Marple's only trying to help." But Jimmy's agitation only grew, and he pushed his glass away, sloshing ale onto the table. "I know what folks think," he muttered. "Jockeys are always under suspicion, taking bribes, fixing races, but I'd never touch Firebrand. He was my ticket to the top." His voice broke, and he looked away, his jaw tight. Miss Marple patted his hand gently, her touch light but deliberate. "Of course, Mr. Walsh, the truth has a way of rising, like cream in a churn. You've nothing to fear if you've nothing to hide." Her words were kind, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way Jimmy's shoulders slumped, as if her reassurance only deepened his unease. She rose, signaling to the colonel, and they stepped toward the bar, where Nellie, the barmaid, was now polishing a tankard with a cloth that had seen better days. "A word, if I may," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. Nellie, a sturdy woman with a no-nonsense air, nodded, her hands never pausing. "Aye, ma'am. You're asking about Jimmy, I reckon?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "He says he was here last night. Can you confirm it?" Nellie's eyes flicked toward Jimmy, then back to Miss Marple. "He was here, right enough. Came in around 8, stayed till near closing, played darts, drank his usual. But he did step out for a bit, like he said, round 10. Said he needed a smoke. Back in 10 minutes, no more." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple caught a hint of hesitation, as if Nellie knew more than she let on. "And did you see him with anyone?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. Nellie's cloth slowed, and she frowned. "Not as such, ma'am, but there was a man outside, loitering by the alley when I took the bins out. Didn't see his face, too dark. Jimmy came back looking rattled, though. Didn't say why." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. A man in the alley, Jimmy's rattled return, the bruise on his wrist. "Thank you, Nellie," she said, slipping a shilling onto the bar. "You've been most helpful." As they left the Red Lion, Colonel Bantry lit his pipe, puffing thoughtfully. "That lad's scared out of his wits, Jane. Think he's mixed up in this?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her eyes on the village street, where a cart rattled past, its driver whistling tunelessly. "Fear, Arthur, is a powerful thing," she said. "Young Mr. Walsh is afraid, but not, I think, of being caught. He's afraid of something, or someone else. That bruise, that nervous glance, they tell a story, and Nellie's man in the alley may be part of it." The colonel grunted, unconvinced. "Sounds like a lad in over his head. Debts, maybe. Jockeys often fall into that trap." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "Perhaps, Arthur, but fear can come from many quarters. Debt, yes, but also knowledge. Jimmy Walsh knows something, and it weighs on him. We shall see what else the village has to say." As they walked to the Bentley, her mind turned over the pieces. Jimmy's trembling hands, the bruise, the man in the alley, the lie about the cigarette. Small things, but to Miss Marple they were like stitches in a quilt, each one essential to the pattern that would reveal the truth about Firebrand's disappearance. Chapter 6. The Rival's Ambition. The road to Lord Cedric Ashby's estate wound through the undulating hills beyond Darrowby, where ancient oaks cast dappled shadows on fields stitched with stone walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated beside Colonel Bantry in his trusty Bentley, gazed out at the passing landscape, her thoughts as orderly as the hedgerows. The visit to the Red Lion had left her with a tangle of impressions. Jimmy Walsh's fear, Nellie's guarded words, the shadow of a man in the alley. But she felt the threads of the mystery beginning to align. Lord Ashby, Firebrand's rival, and a man whose polished charm had not escaped her notice, was the next piece to examine. "A man like Lord Ashby," she had remarked to the colonel over a hasty luncheon, "builds his world with care. But ambition, Arthur, often leaves cracks in even the smoothest façade." The colonel, puffing on his pipe, had merely grunted, but he agreed to drive her to Ashby Hall, curious to see what her sharp eyes might uncover. The estate loomed into view as they crested a hill, its sleek lines and modern additions a stark contrast to the weathered grandeur of Harcourt's manor. Ashby Hall was a study in calculated elegance. Its cream-colored stone glowed in the afternoon light, and its gardens, clipped to precision, framed a drive lined with gravel. So pristine, it seemed no wheel had ever disturbed it. As the Bentley crunched to a stop, a footman in immaculate livery appeared to open the door, his movements as crisp as the starched collar he wore. Miss Marple stepped out, her black shawl and modest hat rendering her a figure of quiet inconsequence, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing. The polished brass knocker, the faint scent of liniment wafting from the direction of the stables, the way the footman's gaze lingered on the horizon, as if watching for something unseen. Lord Ashby greeted them in the drawing-room, a spacious chamber adorned with modernist paintings and a crystal chandelier that caught the light like a prism. He was a man in his late 50s, his silver hair swept back, his tailored suit accentuating a frame still lean from years of riding. His smile was warm, his handshake firm, but Miss Marple noted the sharpness in his blue eyes, like a hawk assessing its quarry. "Miss Marple, Colonel Bantry," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "A pleasure to see you, though I wish it were under happier circumstances. This business with Firebrand is a tragedy. Harcourt must be devastated." His tone carried just the right note of sympathy, but Miss Marple, attuned to the subtleties of human nature, sensed a practiced quality, as if the words had been polished like the silver tea service before them. "Most kind of you to say, Lord Ashby," she replied, settling into a plush armchair, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. "It is indeed a blow to the racing world. Firebrand's absence must shift the odds in favor of your own horse, Silverstreak, I presume?" Her question was gentle, almost idle, but her eyes held his, steady and unyielding. Ashby's smile flickered, just for a moment, before he recovered, pouring tea with a steady hand. "Silverstreak is a fine horse, Miss Marple, but I'd rather win on merit than circumstance. Racing is a gentleman's sport, after all." His laugh was light, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers lingered on the teapot's handle. She sipped her tea, the delicate china warm against her fingers, and let the silence stretch. "Of course," she said at last, "and yet competition can bring out such passions. I understand you and Mr. Harcourt have a history, business dealings perhaps that left some discord." Ashby's eyes narrowed, but his smile held. "Old news, Miss Marple. A venture years ago, a shipping concern that went sour. Harcourt took it personally, but that's the game of business. No reason to tamper with his horse, if that's what you're implying." His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the faint edge, like a blade hidden in velvet. Colonel Bantry, who had been eyeing a plate of scones with interest, cleared his throat. "No one's implying anything, Ashby. Just trying to make sense of this mess. Damned odd, a horse vanishing like that." Ashby nodded, his expression one of studied concern. "Odd indeed, Colonel. My own stables are locked tight. Can't be too careful. But Harcourt's people are reliable, or so I thought. Brady's a steady hand, though I hear young Walsh has a wild streak." His words were casual, but Miss Marple's ears pricked at the mention of Jimmy, sensing a deliberate nudge. "Mr. Walsh does seem troubled," she said, her voice mild. "Youth often carries its burdens. But your stables, Lord Ashby, they must be a marvel. Might we see them? I confess, I know little of horses, but I'm told yours are the finest." Ashby hesitated, then rose with a gracious smile. "Of course, Miss Marple. A pleasure to show you." He led them through the gardens to a set of stables that gleamed with fresh paint, their iron fittings polished to a mirror shine. The grooms moved with quiet efficiency, and the horses, sleek and well-groomed, snorted softly in their stalls. Silverstreak, a dappled gray with eyes like polished jet, stood proudly in the center, his coat gleaming under the stable's electric lights. Miss Marple wandered the aisle, her steps slow, her eyes taking in every detail. The pristine straw, the orderly tack room, the faint smell of liniment that matched the scent she had noted at Darrowby Downs. A young groom, polishing a saddle, glanced up as they passed, his face open but wary. Miss Marple paused, her hand brushing a bridle hung on the wall. "Such care you take," she said to Ashby. "Your grooms must be busy, especially with deliveries. Hay, perhaps, to keep the horses fed." Ashby's smile was unwavering. "We're well supplied, Miss Marple. Local farms, mostly. Gibbs, down the road, sends a wagon now and then." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught a faint stiffness in his posture, as if the question had grazed a nerve. As they returned to the house, she overheard the groom mutter to another, "No hay from Gibbs this week, though." His lordship cancelled the order. The words were low, but Miss Marple's hearing was as sharp as her wits, and she tucked the detail away, alongside the liniment scent and Ashby's too perfect composure. Back in the drawing-room, Ashby offered sherry, but Miss Marple declined, citing the lateness of the hour. "You've been most generous, Lord Ashby," she said, her smile serene. "I'm sure Firebrand will be found soon. Truth, you know, has a way of breaking free, like a horse from a stall." Ashby's laugh was hearty, but his eyes followed her to the door, and she felt their weight, like a hand testing a lock. In the Bentley, Colonel Bantry lit his pipe, the smoke curling in the evening air. "Smooth as silk, that Ashby," he said. "But you rattled him, Jane. What's your game?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her gaze on the darkening hills. "No game, Arthur, merely observation. Lord Ashby is a man who controls his world, but control can be a mask. That liniment scent, the cancelled hay order, they are small things. But small things, I find, often lead to larger truths." The colonel grunted, unconvinced, but Miss Marple's mind was already weaving the day's threads. Ashby's practiced charm, the groom's muttered words, the echo of ambition in his voice. The pattern was forming, and she knew that somewhere, in the cracks of his carefully built world, lay the key to Firebrand's disappearance. Chapter 7. The Village Gossip. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and drowsy lanes, seemed a world apart from the fevered tension of Darrowby Downs. Yet Miss Jane Marple knew that even the quietest hamlets held secrets as tangled as any city intrigue. After her visit to Lord Ashby's estate, she had returned to Colonel Bantry's manor, her mind abuzz with the day's observations, the liniment scent in Ashby's stables, the groom's muttered remark about the cancelled hay order, the faint edge in Ashby's polished demeanor. But it was the village, she felt, that might offer the next clue. For gossip, like a spider's web, caught fragments of truth that the grander settings often concealed. Over a simple supper of cold chicken and salad, she had persuaded the colonel to delay their return to Darrowby, suggesting a morning spent in St. Mary Mead. "Villages, Arthur," she said, her eyes twinkling over her teacup, "are like teapots, unassuming, but always simmering with something to pour out." The next morning, under a sky dappled with clouds, Miss Marple set out on foot, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders and her sensible hat pinned firmly in place. The colonel, claiming a touch of rheumatism, had opted to stay behind with his newspapers, leaving her to her mission. She made her way to the post office, a small, ivy-clad building at the village's heart, where Mrs. Price, the postmistress, presided like a general over her counter of stamps and parcels. Mrs. Price was a woman of middle years, her sharp eyes and sharper tongue making her the unofficial chronicler of St. Mary Mead's comings and goings. Miss Marple, who had known her for years, entered with a smile, her handbag clasped before her like a shield. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," she said, her voice warm and unhurried. "I trust the post is running smoothly today." Mrs. Price, wiping her hands on an apron, returned the smile, though her eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Smooth enough, Miss Marple, though the village is all aflutter about that horse business at Darrowby. Firebrand, wasn't it? Vanished like a ghost, they say. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Folk here reckon it's no accident. A horse like that doesn't just wander off. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest, though her mind was alert. Indeed, she said. And what do folks say about those involved? Mr. Harcourt, perhaps, or Lord Ashby? Mrs. Price's eyes lit up, and she leaned closer, her voice dropping further. Well, now, Harcourt's a big name round here, with his manor and his money, but he's not as steady as he seems, if you take my meaning. Always fussing with that watch chain, like a man with something to hide. And Lord Ashby, oh, he's a smooth one, but there's bad blood between him and Harcourt. Years back, they had a falling out over some deal, shipping or some such. Ashby came out on top, and Harcourt's never forgotten it. Wouldn't surprise me if Ashby's hand was in this, just to twist the knife. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. A grudge can be a powerful thing, she murmured. And what of the others? The trainer, Mr. Brady, or young Mr. Walsh? Mrs. Price snorted, straightening a stack of envelopes with a brisk snap. Brady's a closed book, that one. Keeps to himself, but he's been seen about the downs at odd hours, talking to strangers. One of the lads at the Red Lion swore he saw Brady with a man who limped, night before last, near the old oak by the racecourse. As for Jimmy Walsh, poor lad's in over his head. Word is he owes money to some rough types in Darrowby, bookmakers likely. They don't take kindly to unpaid debts. Her voice carried a note of pity, but her eyes gleamed with the thrill of scandal. Miss Marple's smile was faint but encouraging. How very interesting, she said, slipping a coin across the counter for a stamp she didn't need. You have a keen eye, Mrs. Price. A man with a limp, you say, most curious. And do these bookmakers frequent the village? Mrs. Price nodded, her apron rustling as she leaned in again. Aye, there's a fellow called Stokes, runs with a hard crowd. Seen him at the Red Lion, pressing Jimmy more than once. Rough voice, walks with a stick since a bad fall years ago. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her face remained serene. A man with a limp, she thought, tying Brady's late-night meeting to Nellie's shadowed figure in the alley. The thread was thin, but it held. Thanking Mrs. Price, Miss Marple stepped out into the village square, her mind turning over the new pieces. She made her way to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was tending her roses, her hands deft despite the thorns. Mrs. Clement, a gentle soul with a knack for hearing confessions unasked, welcomed Miss Marple with a warm smile and an offer of tea. Over delicate cups in the vicarage's sunny parlor, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the racecourse. "Such a stir about that horse, Mrs. Clement," she said, nibbling a biscuit. "I wonder if you've heard anything of note, perhaps about the stables, or those who work there." Mrs. Clement's eyes widened, and she set her cup down with a soft clink. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all anyone talks about. The vicar says it's a sin, stealing a creature like that. But there's talk of a farmer, old man Gibbs, out by the downs. He's got a barn he rents out to folk who don't ask questions. Discreet, you know. Some say he's taken in horses before, when owners wanted them out of sight." Her voice dropped, as if the roses might overhear. "And young Peter, Brady's nephew, he's been looking peaky, like he's carrying a secret. I saw him at church last Sunday, fidgeting something awful." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained placid. "A barn," she said softly, as if to herself. "A fine place to hide something large, don't you think?" Mrs. Clement nodded, her hands fluttering. "Oh, yes. Gibbs is a queer sort, keeps his own counsel, but he's not above a bit of profit if the price is right." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving the strands together. Gibbs's barn, Peter's unease, the man with the limp. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Clement," she said, rising with a smile. "The village always has a way of knowing more than it lets on." As she walked back to Colonel Bantry's manor, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the lane, Miss Marple felt the pattern of the mystery taking shape. The gossip of St. Mary Mead, like the chatter of her own village, was a tapestry of half-truths and sharp insights, and she knew how to pick out the threads that mattered. Mrs. Price's tale of the limping man, Mrs. Clement's mention of Gibbs's barn. These were not mere rumors, but signposts to the truth. Back at the manor, the colonel greeted her with a raised eyebrow. "Well, Jane, turned up any scandals in the village?" he asked, his tone teasing. Miss Marple settled into an armchair by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly as she began a new row. "Scandals, Arthur, are merely secrets in plain sight," she said, her eyes distant. "The village tells us that Mr. Brady keeps late hours, that young Mr. Walsh carries debts, and that Lord Ashby's grudge against Mr. Harcourt runs deep. And then there's old man Gibbs, with his barn, a most intriguing possibility." The colonel frowned, his pipe sending curls of smoke toward the ceiling. "A barn? You think firebrands hidden there?" Miss Marple's smile was serene but knowing. "I think, Arthur, that people leave traces even when they mean to hide them, and traces, in time, lead to truth." Her needles clicked on, steady as a heartbeat, as she wove the village's whispers into the growing tapestry of the case. Chapter 8. The Hidden Trail. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Colonel Bantry's drawing room, casting delicate patterns on the polished floorboards as Miss Jane Marple sipped her tea. The revelations of St. Mary Mead's gossip, old man Gibbs's barn, the limping stranger, Jimmy Walsh's debts, and the shadow of Lord Ashby's grudge had woven a tighter web in her mind, and she felt the mystery of Firebrand's disappearance drawing closer to its heart. Over breakfast, she had proposed a visit to Gibbs's farm, a suggestion that met with Colonel Bantry's raised eyebrows but grudging agreement. "A barn, Jane?" he had said, buttering his toast with vigor. "You're chasing shadows now." But Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling over her cup, had replied, "Shadows, Arthur, often point to something solid. A horse is a large thing to hide, but a barn is larger still." And so, with the Bentley's engine rumbling, they set off for the farm, the rolling downs giving way to rougher fields as they neared their destination. Gibbs's farm lay in a hollow beyond Darrowby, its weathered buildings half hidden by a copse of willows. The farmhouse itself was a squat, stone affair, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders, and the barn, a looming structure of gray timber, stood apart, its doors secured with a heavy chain. As the Bentley pulled up, Miss Marple noted the air of neglect, the overgrown path, the rusted plow leaning against a shed, the faint whiff of damp hay. Old man Gibbs emerged from the farmhouse, a wiry figure with a face like crumpled parchment, his eyes squinting against the light. His gait was slow, deliberate, and he leaned lightly on a stick, though Miss Marple observed it was more habit than necessity. "Morning," he said gruffly, eyeing the colonel's car with suspicion. "What brings you here?" Colonel Bantry, stepping out with his usual bluff cheer, introduced himself and Miss Marple, mentioning their interest in the racecourse trouble. Gibbs's eyes narrowed further, but he nodded, gesturing toward the barn. "Heard about the horse? Aye. Bad business, but I've no part in it." His voice was flat, but Miss Marple caught the faintest quiver, like a leaf trembling before a storm. She smiled, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and said, "Of course, Mr. Gibbs, we're merely seeking to understand. A farm like yours, so close to the downs, must see all sorts of comings and goings. Might we look at your barn? I've always admired a well-kept farm." Gibbs hesitated, his fingers tightening on his stick, but her gentle tone and unassuming air seemed to disarm him. "Reckon you can look," he muttered, leading them to the barn. The chain rattled as he unlocked it, and the doors creaked open, revealing a cavernous interior, thick with the scent of hay and old wood. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the high windows, and Miss Marple's eyes scanned the space with quiet intensity. The floor was strewn with straw, but her sharp gaze caught a patch near the back where it seemed fresher, as if recently disturbed. A few chestnut hairs clung to a splintered beam, and on a nail by the door hung a scrap of blue cloth, its edge frayed but bearing a faint monogram. "C.A." "Most interesting," she murmured, bending to examine the hairs, her movements slow to avoid drawing Gibbs's attention. The colonel, peering into the shadows, snorted. "Looks like any old barn to me, Jane. Smells of horses, though. Could be something to it." Gibbs, standing by the door, shifted uneasily. "Keep a few nags for the plow," he said, his tone defensive. "Nothing fancy like that racehorse." Miss Marple straightened, her smile serene. "Of course, Mr. Gibbs, but a fine horse like Firebrand might tempt someone to borrow your barn for a night, might it not? For a price, perhaps?" Gibbs's face darkened, and he gripped his stick tighter. "I don't deal in stolen goods, ma'am," he said sharply. But Miss Marple's gentle persistence pressed on. "No one suggests you do," she said, her voice soothing. "But a man came here last night, did he not? With a horse, perhaps?" Gibbs's eyes flickered, and for a moment she thought he might deny it. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Aye, a man came. Night before last, late. Brought a chestnut horse, fine beast. Paid cash to stable it for a day or two. Didn't ask his name, didn't want to know. Rent's rent." He paused, then added, "Had a limp, he did. Used a stick, like me." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. The limping man, mentioned by Mrs. Price and hinted at by Nellie's tale, was no longer a shadow, but a figure with purpose. "And this man, did he say where he was going?" she asked, her tone as casual as if inquiring about the weather. Gibbs shook his head. "Didn't say, didn't ask. Left the horse and was gone by morning." She nodded, her eyes lingering on the scrap of cloth. "C.A.," she murmured to herself, the initials tying to Lord Ashby's name like a knot in her knitting. As they left the barn, Miss Marple paused by the farmhouse gate, where a willow's branches dipped low, their narrow leaves matching the one she had found in Firebrand's stall. She plucked another, slipping it into her handbag beside the first, her movements unnoticed by Gibbs, who was relocking the barn with a scowl. The colonel, impatient to be off, muttered, "Well, Jane, you've got your horse, or near enough. Shall we call the police?" But Miss Marple shook her head, her eyes distant. "Not yet, Arthur. A barn and a few hares are not proof, but they are a trail. We must follow it carefully." Back in the Bentley, as they rattled toward St. Mary Mead, the colonel pressed her for her thoughts. "That cloth, Jane, those initials. You think Ashby's behind this?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. "I think, Arthur, that someone wishes us to believe so. But a monogram is easily placed, and a horse is not easily hidden. The limping man is the key, I fancy, and young Peter may know more than he's told." Her voice was calm, but her mind was alive, weaving the barn's clues, the chestnut hairs, the blue cloth, the willow leaf, into the pattern of the case. Gibbs's barn was a hiding place, but not the end of the trail, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a horse in full gallop, was waiting just beyond the next turn. Chapter 9. The Web. Titans. The late afternoon sun bathed Colonel Bantry's drawing room in a warm, golden glow, the kind that softened the edges of the world and made even the most tangled mysteries seem momentarily soluble. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The visit to Gibbs's farm had added vital threads to her tapestry: the chestnut hairs, the scrap of blue cloth with its telltale CA monogram, the willow leaf matching the one from Firebrand's stall, and old man Gibbs's grudging admission of a limping stranger. These were not mere fragments, but signposts, pointing toward a truth she felt was close at hand. Yet, as always, she knew the importance of patience, of letting the pattern emerge without forcing the weave. "A web," she had remarked to the colonel over tea, "catches its prey only when it is complete." Her suggestion to invite the key figures, Reginald Harcourt, Tom Brady, Jimmy Walsh, and Lord Cedric Ashby, to the manor for an informal gathering had met with the colonel's bemused approval. "A tea party, Jane?" he had said, his mustache twitching. "You think you'll solve this over scones?" But her quiet insistence, coupled with the promise of answers, had swayed him, and so invitations were sent, couched as a discussion of the race's postponement. By 4 o'clock, the drawing room was ready, its mahogany table set with a silver tea service, delicate sandwiches, and a plate of Mrs. Bantry's renowned lemon tarts. Miss Marple, in her usual black dress with its modest lace collar, sat demurely, her handbag at her side, her eyes as sharp as the needles in her lap. Reginald Harcourt arrived first, his florid face flushed with a mix of nerves and indignation. His hands, as ever, twisted his watch chain, and his eyes darted about the room as if seeking an escape from his own unease. Tom Brady followed, his weathered face set in its customary mask, his boots cleaned now, Miss Marple noted, leaving no trace of the clay she had observed before. Jimmy Walsh slunk in next, his jockey's frame hunched, his eyes avoiding those of his companions, the bruise on his wrist still faintly visible beneath his cuff. Lord Ashby was last, his silver hair gleaming, his smile as polished as the cane he carried, though he leaned on it lightly, more for effect than need. The colonel, playing host with bluff good humor, ushered them to their seats while Miss Marple poured tea with the grace of a vicar's aunt, her every movement calculated to put them at ease. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the room's uneasy silence. "The disappearance of Firebrand has caused such distress, and I thought a quiet talk might shed light on this perplexing matter." Her eyes moved from one man to another, noting Harcourt's fidgeting, Brady's stillness, Walsh's nervous glance toward the window, and Ashby's too perfect composure. "It is curious, is it not? How a horse can vanish from a locked stable with no sign of force? Almost as if someone knew precisely how to open that lock. Brady shifted in his seat, his hands folding tightly. "I told you, ma'am, the stable was secure. I locked it myself, key in my pocket." His voice was gruff, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his eyes. She smiled gently, setting her teacup down with a faint clink. "Indeed, Mr. Brady, and yet I found a pipe cleaner in the stable, tucked beneath a bale. Most curious, for you say you don't smoke a pipe." Brady's jaw tightened, and he muttered, "Must have been one of the lads. Stables are full of clutter." But his fingers gripped the arm of his chair, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush creeping up his neck. She turned to Jimmy Walsh, whose hands were now twisting his cap into a shapeless mass. "Mr. Walsh, you were at the Red Lion that night, you said, but you stepped out briefly, around 10. A smoke, I believe you called it. Yet you don't favor a pipe either, do you?" Jimmy's eyes widened, and he stammered, "No, ma'am, just cigarettes. I wasn't gone long, 10 minutes maybe." His voice was high, almost pleading, and Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was sharp. "10 minutes is time enough for many things," she said, her tone kind but probing. "And debts, I hear, can weigh heavily on a young man. Did someone approach you that night, perhaps, with an offer to ease your burdens?" Jimmy's face drained of color, and he shook his head vehemently. "I didn't do nothing, ma'am. I swear it. I owe a bit, sure, but I'd never touch Firebrand." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple patted his hand, though her eyes noted the way his gaze flicked toward Brady, then away, as if seeking rescue. Colonel Bantry, stirring his tea with a clatter, grunted, "No one's accusing you, lad, but you're jumpy as a colt. Something's eating you." Miss Marple turned at last to Lord Ashby, who sat with the ease of a man accustomed to command, his cane resting lightly against his knee. "Lord Ashby," she said, her voice as mild as ever, "your stables are a model of order, and your horse, Silverstreak, now stands to gain from Firebrand's absence. A fortunate turn, some might say." Ashby's smile was unwavering, though his eyes held a glint of steel. "Fortune favors the prepared, Miss Marple, but I assure you, my success needs no such underhanded means. Silverstreak will win on his own merit." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the faintest tightening of his grip on the cane. "And yet," she continued, her tone almost apologetic, "I heard of a hay delivery from your estate, cancelled at the last moment, though a wagon was seen near the downs that night, and at Gibbs's farm I found a scrap of cloth, blue, with the initials C.A. Most intriguing, don't you think?" Ashby's smile faltered, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. "A coincidence, surely," he said, his voice steady but cooler now. "My initials are hardly unique, and hay deliveries are routine. You're weaving quite a tale, Miss Marple." She smiled, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Tales, Lord Ashby, are often woven from truth. A pipe cleaner, a scrap of cloth, a limping man seen at the downs and Gibbs's barn. These are small things, but they form a pattern. Someone took Firebrand, and someone knew how to unlock that stable." Her eyes moved across the group, resting briefly on each man. Harcourt's twitching hands, Brady's rigid silence, Walsh's trembling fear, Ashby's calculated calm. "The truth," she said softly, "is like a horse in a stall. It cannot stay hidden forever." The men exchanged glances, uneasy and guarded, as the colonel cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Well, Jane, you've got us all on edge. What's next?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her smile serene. "Next, Arthur. We wait. The web is tight, and the truth will struggle free." As the men left, their farewells stiff and hurried, she felt the pattern closing, each thread. Harcourt's fear, Brady's silence, Walsh's debts, Ashby's ambition, drawing her closer to the heart of the mystery. The limping man, she knew, was the key, and she resolved to find him, for he held the final stitch in her carefully woven web. Chapter 10. The Confession. The air in Colonel Bantry's drawing-room hung heavy with the aftermath of Miss Jane Marple's probing questions, the faint clink of teacups now silenced as the four men, Reginald Harcourt, Tom Brady, Jimmy Walsh, and Lord Cedric Ashby, sat in a tense tableau. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across their faces, each marked by its own strain of unease. Miss Marple, her knitting needles still for the moment, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her pale blue eyes moving from one man to another with the quiet intensity of a seamstress threading a needle. The web she had woven, pipe cleaners, blue cloth, willow leaves, and whispers of a limping man, had tightened, and she sensed the moment had come to draw it closed. Colonel Bantry, his pipe smoldering forgotten in his hand, watched her with a mix of skepticism and anticipation, sensing the air of a hunt nearing its end. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of certainty. "Gentlemen," she began, "we have spoken of many things this afternoon, stables, debts, rivalries, and small traces left behind. But the truth about Firebrand's disappearance is not so complex as it seems. A horse does not vanish without purpose, and that purpose, I believe, lies in the race itself." Her eyes rested on Harcourt, whose fingers twisted his watch chain with such force that the links seemed ready to snap. "Mr. Harcourt, your distress is plain, but it is not, I think, for the loss of Firebrand alone. You fear what this theft reveals, perhaps a weakness in your own circle?" Harcourt's face reddened, and he sputtered. "I've nothing to hide, Miss Marple. Firebrand was my pride, my investment. Whoever took him struck at my very heart." His voice was loud, almost theatrical, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his eyes avoided hers. She nodded, as if accepting his words, and turned to Brady, whose weathered face remained a mask of stoic reserve. "Mr. Brady, you locked the stable, yet Firebrand was taken. You saw someone that night, did you not? Near the downs, under the old oak, as young Peter observed. A man with a limp, perhaps." Brady's hands clenched, his knuckles whitening against the arms of his chair. "I told you, ma'am, I heard nothing, saw nothing," he said, his voice low and tight. But his eyes flickered, betraying a crack in his armor, and Miss Marple pressed gently, her tone as kind as a nurse soothing a patient. "And yet, Peter saw you speaking in the dark. A trainer's loyalty is to his horse, but also to his master. Did Mr. Harcourt ask you to keep silent, or was it another who persuaded you?" Brady's jaw worked silently, and for a moment she thought he might speak, but he only shook his head, his silence a wall she could not yet breach. Jimmy Walsh, pale and trembling, seemed to shrink further into his seat, his cap now a crumpled wreck in his hands. "Mr. Walsh," Miss Marple said, her voice softening further, "your fear is plain, and I do not believe you meant harm to Firebrand, but that bruise on your wrist and your meeting in the alley, someone pressed you, didn't they? Not for money, perhaps, but for information or access." Jimmy's eyes widened, and he stammered, I didn't. I swear, ma'am. I didn't help steal him. I owe money, yes, but I'd never betray Firebrand." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Miss Marple patted his arm, her touch light but firm. "Truth, Mr. Walsh, is a balm, even when it stings. You met a man that night, didn't you? A man with a limp?" Jimmy's head jerked up, his eyes wild with panic. "Yes, ma'am. In the alley, behind the Red Lion. He asked about the stable, the lock, said he'd clear my debts if I told him. I didn't give him the key, I swear. I just told him where it was kept." His voice dropped to a whisper, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave but not unkind. "A small thing, Mr. Walsh, but small things can open large doors." She turned at last to Lord Ashby, whose polished composure had begun to fray, his cane now gripped tightly in both hands. "Lord Ashby," she said, her voice as gentle as ever, "your ambition for Silver Streak is no secret, nor is your old rivalry with Mr. Harcourt. The scrap of cloth in Gibbs's barn, marked C.A., points to you, as does the cancelled hay delivery, which left a wagon free to carry a horse in the night, and the limping man, seen by Brady and Walsh, was in your employ, was he not?" Her words hung in the air, and the room seemed to still. The crackle of the fire, the only sound. Ashby's smile was gone, his eyes cold and hard. "You weave a clever story, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low but steady. "But a scrap of cloth and village gossip prove nothing. I've no need to steal horses to win races." His words were defiant, but Miss Marple saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers whitened on the cane. She leaned forward, her eyes holding his with unyielding clarity. "The limping man, Lord Ashby, took Firebrand to Gibbs's barn, paid for with your money. Your rivalry with Mr. Harcourt drove you to ensure Silver Streak's victory, not by skill, but by sabotage. The cloth was a mistake, perhaps, but mistakes are what betray us." Ashby's face darkened, and for a moment she thought he would deny it further. Then his shoulders slumped, and he leaned back, his cane clattering to the floor. "It was business," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Harcourt's had his run, lording it over the racing world. I meant no harm to the horse, just to keep him out of the race. He was to be returned after." His confession was quiet, almost sullen, and Miss Marple felt a pang of pity, though her resolve did not waver. Brady, his silence breaking at last, spoke up, his voice rough with shame. "I saw the man, ma'am. Didn't know he was Ashby's till later. He offered me money to look the other way, said it was just for a night. I didn't take it, but I didn't stop him either." His eyes dropped, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. "Loyalty, Mr. Brady, can be a heavy burden," she said. Jimmy, still trembling, whispered, "I'm sorry, ma'am." I didn't know what he'd do. Harcourt, who had been silent, exploded to his feet, his face purple. "Ashby, you blackguard, you'd ruin me for a race." But Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm but firm. "Anger, Mr. Harcourt, will not bring Firebrand back, but the truth will." She turned to the colonel, who was staring, his pipe forgotten. "Arthur, perhaps you might telephone the police. Firebrand, I believe, is still in Gibbs's barn, and the limping man may yet be found." As the men sat in stunned silence, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The web was complete, and the truth, as she had promised, had struggled free. Ashby's ambition, Brady's silence, Walsh's fear, they had all played their parts, but it was the small things, the overlooked traces, that had led her to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 11. The Horse Returns. The twilight sky over Darrowby Downs was streaked with violet and gold as Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of Colonel Bantry's garden, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders. The confession in the drawing-room had unraveled the knot of Firebrand's disappearance, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle resolved, though her work was not yet done. Lord Ashby's admission, grudging and bitter, had confirmed her suspicions, and Tom Brady's reluctant corroboration, coupled with Jimmy Walsh's tearful confession, had laid bare the scheme. The limping man, a hired hand in Ashby's employ, had been the key, and Miss Marple had urged the colonel to telephone the county police at once. "Firebrand is still in Gibbs's barn, Arthur," she had said, her voice calm but certain. "And the sooner he is found, the sooner this matter can be put to rest." The colonel, still reeling from the afternoon's revelations, had complied, his call to the police setting in motion a swift response. By dusk, a pair of constables, led by the stolid Inspector Crane, had descended on old man Gibbs's farm, guided by Miss Marple's precise directions. She had declined to accompany them, citing a preference for the quiet of the manor, but her mind was with the search, piecing together the final threads. The chestnut hairs, the monogrammed cloth, the willow leaf, and the limping man's shadow that had woven through the village's whispers. Colonel Bantry, however, insisted on joining the police, his sense of duty roused by the prospect of action. "I'll see that horse back myself, Jane," he had declared, his mustache bristling with resolve. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple sat by the fire. In the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, her thoughts turning over the day's events. The colonel returned just as the clock struck 8, his face flushed with triumph. "Found him, Jane," he announced, striding in with a gust of cool air. "Firebrand, right as rain in Gibbs's barn, just as you said. The limping man, fellow called Stokes, a rough sort Ashby hired from Darrowby, was nabbed trying to slip out of the village. Admitted everything under pressure. Ashby paid him to move the horse, meant to keep it hidden till after the race." He sank into an armchair, accepting a glass of whiskey from Mrs. Bantry, who had appeared to hear the news. Miss Marple's smile was faint but warm. "I am glad to hear it, Arthur. And Firebrand, he is unharmed?" The colonel nodded, sipping his drink. "Fit as a fiddle, though a bit restless. Gibbs swore he knew nothing beyond the rent, but the police are questioning him. Harcourt's over the moon, says he'll have Firebrand ready for the rescheduled race next week." His eyes twinkled. "You've done it again, Jane. How you pieced it together from pipe cleaners and bits of cloth, I'll never know." She set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "It is never the things themselves, Arthur, but what they tell us. A pipe cleaner in a stable, a scrap of cloth in a barn, a boy's nervous glance. These are like stitches in a pattern. Alone, they mean little, but together they form a picture." She paused, her eyes distant. Lord Ashby's ambition was his undoing, but it was Mr. Brady's silence and young Mr. Walsh's fear that pointed the way. People, you see, cannot help but leave traces of their truths. Mrs. Bantry, settling beside her husband, shook her head in wonder. "But Jane, how did you know the horse was in Gibbs's barn? And that limping man? Stokes, was it? You hadn't even met him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "I didn't need to meet him, Dolly. The village told me he was there. Mrs. Price's gossip, Nellie's tale of the alley, Peter's whispered sighting. and Gibbs's barn was the only place a horse could be hidden so near the downs. The cloth with CA was a clue, perhaps too obvious, but it was the willow leaf that confirmed it, matching the one from Firebrand's stall. The colonel chuckled, raising his glass. "You're a marvel, Jane. Harcourt's calling you a miracle worker, says he'll name his next foal after you." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, almost self-deprecating. "I'd rather he didn't, Arthur. A horse deserves a grander name than mine, but I am glad Firebrand is safe, and that the race may go on fairly." Her needles resumed their clicking, a steady counterpoint to the fire's crackle, as she reflected on the human frailties, greed, fear, loyalty, that had woven the mystery. By the next morning, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead and Darrowby, carried by the same gossip that had aided Miss Marple's work. Harcourt, chastened but relieved, visited to express his gratitude, his watch chain still, but his eyes bright with renewed hope. "You've saved my reputation, Miss Marple," he said, clasping her hand. "Firebrand will run, and I'll see Ashby pays for this." She nodded, her smile kind but firm. "Justice, Mr. Harcourt, is best left to the law. Your horse is returned, and that is enough." He left, vowing to tighten his stable's security, and Miss Marple turned her thoughts to the race, content that her part was done. As she sat by the window, watching the village awaken, she felt the quiet peace of a task completed. Firebrand was back, Stokes was in custody, and Ashby faced charges for theft and conspiracy. The web had held, and the truth, as she had known it would, had broken free. But her mind, ever restless, lingered on the small things, the traces that had led her to the truth, and she wondered, as she always did, what other secrets lay hidden in the quiet corners of human hearts. Chapter 12. The Quiet Victory. The fire in Colonel Bantry's drawing-room burned low, its embers casting a soft glow across the faded chintz curtains and the polished oak of the mantelpiece. Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed armchair, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of a metronome, the soft click, click, a counterpoint to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Outside, the night was still, the village of St. Mary Mead wrapped in the hush that follows a storm of scandal. Firebrand's safe return to Darrowby Downs, the arrest of the limping man Stokes, and Lord Ashby's impending trial had set tongues wagging from the post office to the Red Lion. But here, in the warmth of the manor, Miss Marple found peace in the resolution of the mystery. The threads, pipe cleaners, willow leaves, a monogrammed cloth, and the whispered fears of men had woven a tapestry that revealed the truth, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle well solved. Colonel Bantry, sprawled in his favorite chair with a glass of port, was still marveling at the outcome. "Dash it all, Jane," he said, his mustache twitching with a mix of awe and exasperation. "You've outdone yourself this time. Firebrand back in his stall, Ashby facing the law, and all from a bit of cloth and some village tittle-tattle. How do you do it?" His wife, Dolly, perched on the sofa with a novel she had scarcely touched, looked up with a smile. "It's uncanny, Jane. You see things the rest of us miss, like a hawk spotting a mouse in the grass." Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost self-effacing, as she set her knitting aside, a half-finished scarf pooling in her lap. "It is not so remarkable, Dolly," she said, her voice soft but clear. "People are much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or Darrowby Downs. They leave traces, small things, overlooked things, that tell their stories. A pipe cleaner in a stable, a scrap of cloth in a barn, a boy's nervous glance, a scent of liniment. These are not mysteries in themselves, but together they form a pattern, and the pattern leads to truth. Her eyes, pale blue and sharp behind her spectacles, gleamed with the quiet certainty of one who had unraveled many such patterns. The colonel took a sip of his port, his brow furrowed. Still, Jane, it's one thing to notice a leaf or a bit of cloth, another to pin it on Ashby. That cloth with his initials, C.A., was a stroke of luck, wasn't it? Miss Marple's needles paused, and she tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. Luck, Arthur, is often what we call preparation meeting opportunity. The cloth was a clue, yes, but perhaps too convenient. I suspect Lord Ashby's man, Stokes, left it deliberately, either to mislead or to ensure his employer's downfall if caught. Ambition, you see, can blind even the cleverest to the carelessness of their tools. Dolly leaned forward, her novel forgotten. But what of Brady and young Walsh? They knew more than they let on, didn't they? Miss Marple nodded, her hands folding neatly over her knitting. Mr. Brady's silence was born of loyalty, Dolly, and perhaps a touch of shame. He saw Stokes but did not act, fearing for his position. Young Mr. Walsh, poor boy, was trapped by his debts, pressed into giving information he scarcely understood would lead to theft. There, fear and silence wove them into the web, but it was Lord Ashby's ambition that spun it. He sought to humble Mr. Harcourt, to ensure Silver Streak's triumph, but he underestimated the traces he left behind. The colonel grunted, setting his glass down with a clink. And Harcourt? He's crowing now, with Firebrand back and the race rescheduled. Says he'll win by a mile. Miss Marple's smile was tinged with amusement. Mr. Harcourt's pride is restored, and that is enough for him. But pride, Arthur, is a fragile thing, easily shaken by the next storm. I hope he has learned to guard his stables more closely. The following week, the grand stakes took place under a sky of unbroken blue, the downs alive with the roar of the crowd and the thunder of hooves. Firebrand, his chestnut coat gleaming, ran as if the ordeal of his brief captivity had only sharpened his spirit. Jimmy Walsh, pale but determined, rode with a skill that silenced the doubters, guiding the stallion to a victory that set Darrowby alight with cheers. Miss Marple, who had declined to attend, heard the news from the colonel, who returned from the racecourse flushed with excitement. "A cracking run, Jane," he said, tossing his hat onto the hall table. "Firebrand by 3 lengths, and Harcourt's strutting like a peacock. Ashby's in the dock, though, trials set for next month. Stokes is singing like a canary, they say." Miss Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, nodded, her eyes on the flickering flames. "I am glad, Arthur. Justice is a slow horse, but it runs true in the end." She paused, her needles clicking softly. "And young Mr. Walsh? I trust he is free of his burdens?" The colonel nodded, settling into his chair. "Seems so. Harcourt's paid off his debts, out of gratitude or guilt, I reckon. Brady's keeping his head down, but he's still training. Life's back to normal, more or less." But Miss Marple knew that normalcy, in a village like St. Mary Mead or a place like Darrowby, was a veneer over the restless currents of human nature. As she knitted, her mind wandered to the small things, the pipe cleaner, the willow leaf, the whispered fears that had led her to the truth. They were like the stitches in her scarf, unremarkable alone, but vital to the whole. The race was won, the horse returned, the villain unmasked, but she knew that other secrets, other patterns, lay waiting in the quiet corners of the world. As the fire burned lower, She set her knitting aside and rose, her shawl slipping slightly as she moved to the window. The village lay dark and still, its secrets tucked away for now. People, Arthur, she said softly, almost to herself, are never quite what they seem, but their traces, those small, careless traces, always tell the truth. The colonel, half dozing over his port, murmured agreement, and Miss Marple smiled, her eyes on the night, ready for the next thread that might unravel a new mystery.